So, two speakers tonight, Keith Elford. Keith and I have worked together for 20 years, and our second speaker is Matthew Beckford. And yes, we are related, so we'll get that one out of the way right at the beginning. And Matthew's going to talk to us about organisation development and the relationship to cybernetics. And it's been quite interesting because he sent me a note the other day, as did Kerry Lully last month, saying, so what is cybernetics? And bear in mind, you know, that we've known each other a while. I've actually started to write a paper now to try and explain it to me, and then hopefully we'll be able to explain it to other people later. So Keith will talk for about half an hour on the subject of cybernetics and the church, and then we'll have a little quick Q&A at the end, and then Matthew will talk to us about cybernetics and organisation development and whatever comes out of that. Again, quick Q&A, and then we will try and synthesize some meaning from the whole. So yeah, Keith Elford. Current primary activity is actually being a part-time vicar. He is a priest in the Church of England. So West Byfleet, is it, Keith?
Yeah.
Where he's trying to bring order and discipline to the missionary work of saving Surrey from itself. He's also reading for a PhD in I don't know what the topic really. Oh, well, I'd love what you how you
I'll tell you in a minute.
But you can do that, and some of that thinking is hopefully based on some work that he and I have been practicing with people for quite a long time. So Keith, you take over. I'll start the stopwatch, and I'll give you a nudge about 5 minutes out from the end. Away you go.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I'll just share my screen. Oh, host has disabled screen sharing, apparently.
Can you fix, Angus?
Hello, everybody. While that's being fixed, let me just say hello. Good to be with you. I've enjoyed attending these events. I haven't been to all of them, but I've been to several of them. Found them really stimulating and interesting, and I hope that I'll add to that rather than anything else this afternoon. Right, let's try again. That looks like it might work this time. Yes. Okay. This is one of those presentations where the thinking behind it has gone on for quite a long time, but the actual putting together of the presentation was quite relatively quick. So it's one of those presentations which slightly has the flavour of one's script, as much as it is a kind of visual aid. So forgiveness pled for that, if I may. But I'm going to talk about cybernetics in relation to the church, and I'm not going to talk in detail about what I think cybernetics is. I'm waiting to read John's paper on that, but I'm going to talk about how some of the ideas that he and I have worked on together and might be relevant in the context of the church. And I am going to just to do a little bit by way of introduction, personal introduction, because I think it's relevant, really. So I am, as John has said, a clergyman. I'm a priest in the Church of England. For a long time, I was what's called a non-stipendiary priest, which means essentially that I'm not based in a parish for most of my work, but I am currently the part-time priest in charge of West Byfleet for a variety of reasons which I won't go into. But I've also been in management consultancy for, I think it's 23 years or so. And during that time, I guess the main theoretical framework I have worked with is one derived from organizational cybernetics, especially Beard's VSM, and then that has developed further by Pete Dudley and John Beckford. I've always been interested in how the world that I've encountered in management consultancy relates to the world that actually I started in, which is the world of the church. And as a result of that, in 2015, I commenced a part-time PhD program of study, which is I hope going to complete a little later this year at Roehampton University, exploring the Church of England's National Renewal and Reform Programme. And if you don't know what that is, and I'm not expecting you to, I will tell you what it is in a minute. And my kind of approach was to look at its theological and organizational rationale. And at the same time, I wanted to try and demonstrate that the employment of organization theory had kind of theological validity. So if one was approaching the church and life as I do, ultimately from a theological perspective, that that this kind of secular body of theory had validity in that context. And this presentation is based substantially on the research that I've done, although of course it only covers some parts of it. So that's me, and that's how I'm approaching this. Now let me talk a bit about the church. No surprises here, I would have thought. Indicators which are usually seen as indicators of the word that's used usually as decline in the church. So between 1979 and 2005, church Sunday attendance in England declined from 11.7% of the population to 6.3%. I think attendance was around 30% in 1918, according at least to some sources. There are now less than 3 million regular churchgoers, and actually that number will have gone down potentially considerably since those figures were produced. And there's quite a lot of concern that the current COVID lockdown experience will further knock attendance, that some of those who've not been able to go will never go back. So we've got about a third of this church-going population attends Church of England services. Now, that's less than 1 million people. It's probably something like 800,000. And of course, I don't know the exact proportion, but there's a high proportion is age 50 plus. Another interesting indicator is that in 2000, a survey found that 58% of the population in Britain self-identify as religious or spiritual. Those are two different categories. But a YouGov study in 2020 suggested now that 55% of the population, so that's over half, identifies having no religion. And that's been seen as something of a watershed moment in the churches, because it's the first time it's got to that level. And now belief in any form of God, and I put God with a small g there because it covers a variety of perspectives, including, the slightly vague faith in or belief in a higher power, now less than 50% of the population. As I say, that's probably, none of those things are probably a surprise. They're certainly not a surprise to people who are engaged with the church on a regular basis and take any interest in what's going on. Nevertheless, those and plenty of other indicators suggest a very steep decline in most measures of interest, influence, adherence for the church in general and for the Church of England amongst them. And the decline has been particularly steep over the period since the mid-1960s. Now, does this matter? Except to those of us still eccentric and strange enough to be committed to this institution. And in fact, there may be some of you here who think that these are perfectly healthy, normal, and indeed inevitable developments. And you may think partly that might be because you're not at all sure that the church is a very good influence on society, or that its history is particularly to be admired, or you may simply feel that it's an institution and a belief set that's had its day, or whatever. And I'm not here to defend the church's many failures or its sins of commission or omission, as I put there. And there's a long list, and one could spend a lot of time talking about them. I am myself a Christian of orthodox theological convictions, and so for me the decline of the church is concerning. It's an interesting question which is picked up by those who are, as it were, insiders. is that, you know, should we make a distinction between the continuation of the faith and the continuation of the institution? And that is a consideration in all these debates. But I want to suggest to you that there are some reasons for thinking that it matters, or is at least of interest, without necessarily having to share the church, all the church's convictions. So I think there's a very strong argument that's made by Tom Holland, for example, in Dominion. It's been made by others, that our society and culture has been profoundly shaped by Christianity. And that's not just about the influence of the institutions of the church. It's about the influence of the ideas. Actually, one of the things that Holland argues, I think fairly convincingly, is that even secularism itself is a kind of Christian concept, or it certainly wouldn't exist without the Christian background in the way that it does. I also want to suggest that the Church of England has played a very important part in creating our national identity, and I've written briefly on this in John's recent The Intelligent Nation. And there seems to me that there are aspects of that which are and remain very important, not least in the shape of the landscape and the shape of some local communities. And the argument I make in that vignette is that if we think that that's an either outdated or unfortunate influence on national identity, we need to propose one that might replace it if we're to have a coherent society, I suggest. I also, I mean, this is picking up on Holland's points as well, want to suggest that some of our most important ideas and aspirations, such as those to equality, the conviction that the weak matter along with the strong, that love is the supreme value, if those things matter to us in our society, I suggest, or at least Holland suggests, and I go along with him, that these things go back to Christian influences. I also want to suggest that in a divided society, which I think society is always divided and fractious, but it does seem to me to be a particular sense at the moment that we live in a divided society where debate is very difficult, where people tend to take sides. It seems to me that we do need safe spaces for discussion. We need spiritual resources for community building and reconciliation. And you may have ideas about this, but I don't know where else we might look. It seems to me that the church does have those kinds of resources. And I think that's also the case in relation to the society, which does appear to be retreating from the notion of public truth. So those are some reasons why we might think this matters, or at least is of interest. So where's my watch? Oh, better get on with this. So what the Church of England, faced by all those trends, spent a long time ignoring them, really. But then hoping they'd go away. But then in 2015, a national program was launched, the first such program, which was designed for and to support a new focus on what was called numerical and spiritual growth. The cynics thought the spiritual bit was only really in there for window dressing, and that actually what the church was really interested in was in numerical growth, more bums on seats. This is a summary of the main elements of the program. More people to become ordained, using money differently, targeting funds in area so as to support growth where it existed, and to give more money to areas characterized by poverty and deprivation. That sounds absolutely marvelous, doesn't it? I mean, there's a bit more to that. And actually, we're talking about quite a small proportion of the church's total funds when we talk about that funding. But anyway, to reform legal and other procedures to make it easier for dioceses and parishes to be flexible and innovative in their mission, in their work. A complication of life for the Church of England is that it's tied into the law of the land in a way that even other, I mean, most churches are quite bureaucratic, but or most of the long established churches, but the Church of England is tied into the law of the land in a way that others are not. Then there was a new leadership development program for bishops, another for deans of cathedrals, and a new talent pool for potential senior leaders. This was the most controversial of the measures and was received with a great deal of cynicism by certain people anyway. And then there was a whole series of things designed to encourage lay ministry, that is, getting ordinary people who go to church to be very active in their as disciples, as Christians, in all the parts of their lives, and to kind of take their faith out of the church into the world. Now, just looking at it like that, I mean, some of those things, I mean, you might think lots of that's very sensible. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about all of those things in particular. I'm not going to go into them. But and in their own right, I don't argue too much with them. However, if I move on, it kind of has to be said that they've had a generally not very enthusiastic reception, or at least the program as a whole has not had a generally enthusiastic reception in the church. There has been some success in recruiting more clergy and allocating finance differently, but there was a recent impact assessment which was for the synod, general synod, but it was quite thin in what could be claimed. And actually, on the main lines of on the main indicators, decline appears to be continuing. And then COVID has come along, and actually, probably the net result of COVID is that that program, as a distinct program of the Church of England, will probably be discontinued, and something else is in the wings to take its place. Now, I've taken a close look at this program, and as I said at the beginning, I'm most interested in it as an example in terms of its kind of organizational theoretical rationale and its theological or ecclesiological rationale, not really in whether these things are going to be successful or well conceived as individual measures. But overall, there do seem to be some things which one can say and one can notice. And that is that this is a program that doesn't seem to have a very clear organizational or theological rationale. I interviewed lots of people who've been responsible for conceiving it, and it was quite difficult to discover their rationale, except we've lost lots of people, we need more. It also appears that this program, although it's passed by the General Synod, which is like the national parliament, never really been very fully owned outside of a small group. And that's probably linked to the next point, which is that the program was highly influenced by the Church of England's structure and its politics, by what's deemed possible within that structure. Now, you may well know nothing about this, but even a cursory knowledge probably tells you that you've got parishes, you've got dioceses with bishops, and you've got a national church. And although there's a kind of Daily Mail fantasy that there are, that's the church, the Archbishop of Canterbury is like this church's CEO and can therefore be held accountable for everything. In fact, these are all highly independent organizations. So parishes are highly dependent. And of course, all their work is highly dependent on volunteers, which adds to their being difficult to control, if you want to put it that way. Dioceses are highly independent and bishops are virtually impregnable. I remember I was at one point the chaplain to a bishop, and I remember him telling me that he was virtually bomb-proof. He could do anything, they couldn't get rid of him. And the national church consists of a bewildering series of national institutions. I mentioned General Synod, the Church Commissioners, which manages the church's historic financial resources and which is a separate body from the church, formally speaking. There's an Archbishop's Council and many more. So kind of how you get anything done is quite a difficult question, and that's influenced the shape of this program. Let me move on. Oops. I'll get on to how I think cybernetics might offer a useful perspective for the church. And I'm going to come back to how the church might offer at least a relationship to or a useful perspective for cybernetics. So this is not all going to be one way. But I think what I want to say is that a feature of the program of the Renewal and Reform program is that there's little by way of a kind of systemic approach. And actually, there's quite little by way of participation. A relatively small group of people has decided what needs to be done and then use the system to pass that, and then we're all sort of landed with it. So how might cybernetics help? Well, I think one way, and there's lots of ironies in this, because I mean, fancy having to get the church to focus on fundamental questions. I mean, if the church isn't interested in fundamental questions, who is? But let's get the church to focus on fundamental questions like, what is it for? What actually is the purpose of the church? And that might be conceived both in terms of its purpose entirely in its own terms. It's a theological purpose, if you like, but also its purpose in society. What's it actually here for? There's an extensive history, of course, but what does that mean now? And what does that need to look like in the light of societal change? And clearly there's been very considerable change in the environment in which the church operates, and probably especially over that period of 50 or 60 years in which the decline has taken place. And I'm drawing here on the trilogue model, which many of you may or may not, some of you might know anyway, certainly featured heavily in John's work, and was developed, as I understand it, from Beer's work by Pete Dudley, who's not here today, but has been a part of a number of these conversations. So that's the question of identity and purpose. But I think there's also some help potentially for the church in this question of its structure, which I think has been quite problematic in relation to its desire to reform and renew. And the way things are in the Church of England, anyway, arises, I think, from a strange mixture of traditionalism, you know, the local priest as part of a kind of almost feudal structure. You know, they still, in a way, got the remnant of the notion of the, you know, the priest, the squire, etc. And a strong sense of defending that local authority. And a lot of people in the church not really even imagining that there's anything outside of that locality. But actually, more recently, allied to a strongly bureaucratizing tendency, especially at the regional, national level. And those things don't fit all that well together. And there's a lot of resulting frustration. And it's very difficult to get communication from top to bottom, from bottom to top, and very difficult to manage meaningful engagement between those parts, or it's how it's perceived. On the other hand, I don't want to suggest that trying to change all that, certainly not now anyway, is a viable or useful way of spending time. It would tie up energy for goodness knows how long, and who knows what result it would have. But I suggest, what I want to suggest is drawing on some of the principles of cybernetics, that one of the things the church could do is see its structure as a positive example of distributed authority and start to use it that way. Instead of fighting with it, use it. And at the moment, as I think with a lot of organizations, the kind of direction of travel is to draw more control to the center, because that's where we can, it's where we can get things. We need to get things done. We need to get things done. But perhaps we could use that that distributed authority, less in terms of hierarchies of authority and status, which I think is the way that it's become, whatever it should be, it's kind of the way it's become, and instead ask what behavior we might require of the leadership and management exercised by people at various levels. So we might ask, for example, what concerns, what matters might best be addressed according to the view at various different, if you like, levels or places in the structure. What can best be done in a parish? What can best be done, another structure I missed out was the deanery, which is a kind of larger but still fairly local grouping. What can best be done in the diocese, and what can best be done nationally? And maybe we could have a kind of conversation about that. There's not much conversation on these things. It's all terribly procedural. And I'm there deliberately contrasting, you know, more open kind of conversation with highly, you know, processual and procedured bureaucratic types of management. And then I said I'd turn it around so it comes the other way. I'm assuming I need to finish, John, fairly quickly. There are some ironies here that the church needs to be reminded that role and status are not the same thing. I mean, there's an irony there. I mean, this is the organization based on the teaching of Christ, who rebuked his disciples for seeking to sit at his right and left hand when he came into his kingdom, who told the dying thief that he would be with him in paradise today, and who himself submitted to death on a cross, or was at least his life came to that. Do we really need to learn again that role and status are not the same thing? Irony that a 1,500-year-old institution might need to learn some lessons in sustainability from a 50 to 60-year-old discipline. So maybe there's something that might come back the other way, or at least the church might relearn some of its own lessons. And I think the point I want to make here is that actually, I think there are affinities between ideas found in cybernetics and those held dear in the church's traditions. So for example, if we consider a report like Faithful Improvisation by the Church of England's Faith and Order Commission 2012, I think, the church, according to that analysis, has in fact generally changed over its period of its history by the ability to so deeply inhabit its traditions that it is able to use them to reinterpret its activity appropriately in the light of new circumstances. And perhaps the reason the church has had such a long life, I put there aside from the Holy Spirit, because I do bring to it a theological conviction about that, but leaving that aside, it's probably something to do with its powerful and enduring sense of purpose, which one does not find in all organizations. And actually also, despite failures in its commitment to the values of love, justice, the value of all people and so forth, actually its commitment to those things is sustained and underpinned by an ontology, if you like, which is not available to everybody. And despite its history of clericalism and prince bishops, some of whom still exist, at least in their own heads, the church has a theological commitment to the idea of leadership as service. And I think, given what's been happening in the last few years in our country, and elsewhere, we stand deeply in need of that concept today, I suggest. John, I don't know how I've done for time, but I finished. Thank you very much.
Oh, splendid stuff, Keith. 27 minutes, 36 seconds. So that's really good. And I shall reset it. So we'll start with a clean clock in a few minutes' time. So just a sort of couple of questions that have come up in the chat in there, Keith. If you'd like to unshare for a minute so we can...
Yeah, and I can see the chat.
Faces. Thank you. So I found that I was sort of on tenterhooks at when's the cybernetics going to happen, and suddenly it did. So that was quite exciting. Seymour, where are you, Seymour? You wrote in a question. We'd like to throw that one at Keith about urgency.
My sense is, given we have this large, if I might use the term, bureaucratic structure, that we're trying to move forward, albeit slowly, is there any sense of urgency in the church? When people looked at the reports and recognized that attendance is down, numbers are down, was there a sense of we must change, or, oh dear, things will bump along as they always have? Because it seems to me a sense of urgency has always been a wonderful tool to encourage things like, as you noted, a distributed leadership model, which requires a lot of overcoming of fear, to say the least. So,
yeah.
What's your thoughts?
That's a good point. I think to the change of, I suppose, when I say change of behaviour, I talked about, didn't I? And that's probably, amounts to a change of culture. When you start putting it all together, it would require a lot of commitment, I think, to do that. I think the answer to your question is that at the local level, there is a lot of anxiety. I mean, just in the most ordinary everyday things, people can't be found to do what have always been regarded as quite important jobs. There isn't enough money, which is a reflection of attendance and adherence. People look around on a Sunday morning and they can see that there's a lot of worry about there aren't any young people. So at a local level, there's a lot of anxiety. I think at a local level, at the same time, people find it quite difficult to imagine what an alternative might look like. I think that's a big problem. I think at the larger national level, I think there are those who are very urgent about it, and they're probably the people who've driven this program. And the Archbishop, Justin Welby, would be one of those. I mean, we're just talking about the Church of England, but there are a similar picture, I think, I got to know the Methodist Church quite well recently because of some research I've been doing, and I think there's a similar picture there in the UK. So there are some who are really urgent about it, and so urgent about it, they just feel the need to just make something happen. And whatever my criticisms of that program might be, I have some sympathy with that. So there's that. And then I think there are those who think there's a problem, but don't like the way it's being addressed, and therefore are difficult to play. Difficult to get them to play. And then there are those, and I think there are quite a few of them who say it doesn't matter. God, it'll be what God wants it to be. Okay, maybe that or I mean, some people take refuge, I think, in arguments which have some appeal, but which are not very convincing to my mind. There's never been that many people who really believed in it and all that. Well, that's maybe true, but nevertheless, and stuff like that. So I think there's a very great range of opinion, and I think part of the problem is that there has been no work done to articulate the problem.
I'm going to stop you there, Keith, and I'll take one more question. This one's from David Dewhurst, who's sat to your left on my screen.
Oh, I can see him. Hi, David.
And David says you have to...
Bernard had his hand up as well.
You have to convince people Christianity is true, or at least that theism is valid, to market to the punters. So we're going to go with that one, and then we're going to move on, and we'll come back to them all after we've heard the second talk, because there are threads already emerging which will, I suspect, link these two. So, David, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, expand your question, David. You're muted at the moment. David, you're muted at the moment. John, David's muted, and I think
I'm asking him to unmute.
There you are.
Yeah, I feel as a member of the electoral roll on my local Anglican church, I can afford to be more challenging than most of the polite atheists and agnostics with us today and in cybernetics generally. I can see one or two systems improvements and approaches. Like, as I say, the whole thing is terribly hierarchical and uninteracted. I mean, sermons are normally one way, or they're sort of Mickey Mouse exercises if there is anything coming back from the congregation, unlike how they operated in the 16th, 17th century. I think we've got to get the members of the clergy understanding the variety of theological debate, and if they did that, they'd do a much better job of beating the likes of Dawkins, who's not that sophisticated and an atheist intellectually. So basically, is it really a systems problem? Is it not more of a sort of validation problem? And I very often prefer talking with atheists and agnostics, because many of my own fraternity sorority are they believe that atoms are small balls, which takes you so far. It's a decent image, but it doesn't take you forever. Whether theology does any good to the world, again, is another question. I suspect if I'd spent less time on it, I'd have been more useful.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think in the end, I mean, in a way, what you raise is the question of the whole future of Christianity. I mean, I know it only really practically exists within the institution of the church, but I mean, there are slightly distinct questions. Yeah, I think in the end, unless Christianity can make a case for its validity and can defend its beliefs or articulate and then defend its beliefs in a way that has some what's the word, impact.
So do I, but can you convince sixth formers?
I don't think myself, I mean, having said what I said, I think people have to encounter it. I mean, I think people have to experience it, because I don't think that, yeah, I'm rowing back on my idea. I mean, yes, we have to be able to defend our point of view, but I think in the end, Christianity, you know, what it claims to be is an encounter with God, and unless it works at that level, then I think it's going to be a bit difficult.
Right, that's a really good point to stop you. I've got to stop you both on that one, because there's another very large rabbit hole looming. If we carry on down that particular route for the time being.
But thank you for these other comments. They look really interesting.
So what we will do is we will hear from Matthew, and then we will circle back to these comments, because actually, if you take out the word Christianity and substitute the word organisation in some of the questions, they remain equally challenging and valid. So I think there's something quite interesting potentially to happen in here. So Matthew, have you got any slides that you want to share, or are you just talking? You have. So Angus, can you give Matthew the ability to share screen? Perfect, thank you. So yes, Matthew is my son. I'm not going to say too much about him, because he can introduce himself and then he can say what he likes about me. His theme is cybernetics and organizational development. I will say he is an organization development specialist, so he's talking about his field, and his opening note to me was two forgotten and maligned fields, the real answers to organizational problems, academic snobbery with no real world application, or badly marketed genius. At which point I'd better shut up and give Matthew the floor. Matthew, I'll start the clock again as soon as I can find it. Off you go.
I'm not muted, am I? It's always a good place to start. No, it looks like people couldn't hear me.
Speak up, but you're fine.
Great. Okay, so hi everybody. I'm going to talk about four things today. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit about why did I bring this topic to this forum and who am I. Then a bit about what is OD, if some of you may well know more about it than me, in which case you can tell me why I'm wrong later. But then I'm going to look at what are some of the shared challenges that exist between these key fields as I see it, and then follow that up with some suggestions, some thoughts about what ways forward are there. It helps, as the question here says, how can these fields contribute to the success of organisational life in 2021 and beyond? So first of all, here, why am I talking about this? This partly was prompted by a conversation I had quite a few years ago. I know Rob was from Maven here, and I was at a Maven event, maybe in 2018, with lots of other people who would classify themselves as organizational development folks. And the exploration of that evening was, what is the future of organizational development, and what does it mean to be a practitioner of that into the future? And then as I've come to various of these talks over the last, however long they've been going on now, a year or so, I've heard a similar theme from people like yourselves, many of whom will probably identify as practitioners of cybernetics. So I was interested about, why are two fields that, quite frankly, outside of the one friend I've got on this call that I know will vaguely know what I'm talking about, most people that I know wouldn't have any idea what cybernetics or organizational development are. That seems like a bit of a shame, in my opinion. So I love great ideas that can kind of reach as many people as possible. So this isn't just an opportunity for me to grind my gears against my father, though that might occur as we go through the talk. So that's kind of what inspired this particular talk. And then in terms of who I am, organizational development specialist would be one way of putting it. I would probably classify it slightly differently. I currently work, you can see in this lovely photo in front of me, this is me in front of a grand screen in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, where I don't work for the church, I work for the Church of Capitalism, otherwise known as Bloomberg. Please don't quote me on saying that, but I work at the moment in the field of diversity and inclusion in our HR department. So I'm working with a couple of our businesses to help them think about what are their plans to be more inclusive of more perspectives in terms of about how they do business, and what can we do to improve representation from underrepresented groups. So the cities that we live in, the workforce represents the cities that we live in. I've been doing that since November. Prior to that, I've been at Bloomberg for about nearly 5 years now, and previously I've been doing roles around talent management, leadership development, all things which I would consider to fall under the branch or the field of organizational development. Prior to that, I worked as a consultant for a firm that's now defunct called Hay Group. Some of you might know Hay Group from back in the day and the Hay method of job measurement. It's now part of Corn Ferry, which is considered to be sort of the biggest, if not necessarily the best, people development practice in the market. And I've consulted across sectors around things like pay, reward, org design, org structure, assessment and development. So I say all that to say is that most of my career has been spent in roles doing things which I would call organizational development. And when I was at that event with Maven a few years ago, I sort of sat there with all these people that were talking about this and thought, I guess I have been doing that for this time, even though that's not something that it was called for me. So let's have a little look then and think about what is OD and also what is cybernetics. So this is the definition of cybernetics, which is on the Cybernetics Society website. Again, I appreciate there's many other definitions of this. And this is a definition of organizational development from Rothy Park. Rothy Park is famous in the UK for sort of being one of the what's the right words? Birthplaces, castles, leaders of the field of organizational development. There's a few things I noticed about these definitions which I thought were interesting to bring up. First of all, cybernetics here refers to itself as a science. There's lots of questions when I've spoken about the field of organizational development. I should also confirm I studied occupational psychology as my master's degree, and so that fits into that field of OD as well. And the question we explored a lot was can you make a science of human behavior in organizations, or is it science as physics is a science? Which again is a big rabbit hole, which I won't get us into now, but I think that's something that I wanted to highlight. Is cybernetics a science, and is organizational development a science? There is, I think, one of the things I know about cybernetics from what I've learned from being around it is the idea of purpose. And I think the idea of purpose is also embedded in organizational development, this idea of facilitating organizational success. That's obviously whatever that means to the practitioner of it. There's also two final things I'd say about this. There's an implication of alignment between control, computation, communication, a sense of alignment there, and organisation development also about alignment. And finally, there's an idea that we're looking at things in a systematic way, and and I'm sure there's many people on this call and they're much more about systemic thinking and theories than I do. But I think that's a very interesting launching point when we think about what are some of the challenges with making some of these things happen. How much of a system, at what point does the system, which bit of the system do we take control of in order to actually do something? And I say that because I'm a practitioner. You know, I've worked as a consultant and in-house, and as much as I love a good philosophical discussion, people expect me to do things in order to get paid at its most basic level. So my first prize for the evening is my one bit of interaction. Who can tell me who this person is? Put your answer in the chat box for me. Anyone guess? Stunned silence. This is impressive for me.
I think you could let people shout out rather than type, Matthew, but
yeah.
I don't think it'll help.
It's very weird for me to have a passive audience. You know, I work for a corporation where I'm lucky if I get 3 minutes before anyone interrupts me, so I appreciate that. So this gentleman is Kurt Lewin. Many of you probably have heard of Lewin's process of change. He's also seen as one of the fathers of organizational development as a field, or fathers or parents, let's be more inclusive of our language. With him being considered as one of the four parents of this field, I think it's important to note that Toby Agan identified that there have been 27 definitions of AD between the period of 1969 and 2003. Those that are more cyberneticians on the call will probably resonate with that lack of agreement about definition. The field of AD was born out of the idea that the world is changing, and if the world is changing, we need to do things within organizations to address that change. The oft quoted, truism prior to the pandemic happening was, the world's getting faster and everything's changing faster and faster and faster, and therefore we've got to do more and more things to do it. One of the great things, my favorite thing about the pandemic has been that suddenly we're not talking about that anymore, are we? Because everyone's been locked at home doing nothing for a long time. Ironically, of course, the pace of the world hasn't actually changed all that much in that time, but that's my little aside and mini rant for a moment. However, I want to just talk for a moment about some of the things that are characteristics of AD as a field. And this, again, these are come from Rothy Park, so you can agree or disagree with me and in partnership with them. AD is about just macro systemic change involving multiple tools. So tools are in and of themselves not OD. OD is a thing that contains those tools. It's about changes to structure, culture, strategy, and processes of a job through and all to our organizations. How do we redesign things from, one person's perspective, but across the company? The application of behavioral science, knowledge and practice to facilitate transformation. That speaks to my personal experience of being trained in psychology, which is sort of like individuals and individual behavior and how that can change organizational behavior. Fourthly, it's about improving organizational effectiveness so that we engage, we involve others in understanding the challenge whilst enabling them to do new things. I think that resonates with what Keith was just talking about around the church and who was engaged in the change program of the church. Fifth, it's about the facilitation of change in a flexible, adaptive and participative way. I think that for me resonates with what I know about cybernetics. And lastly, it's about sustainability of change interventions. And I'm sure all of you could tell me a graveyard of change projects you've worked on which were not as sustainable as we hoped they might be. So Kurt Lewin was one of the founders and he talked about this. And before I move on to talk about what I see as some of the shared challenges between cybernetics and organizational development, I want to just touch on 3 models that have come out of OD practitioners. So Lewin's model famously is the unfreeze, change and freeze model of change. So before you make a change, you must be prepared and motivated for change. And so we need to unfreeze our own behaviors, we need to unlearn things in order to then put new behaviors in and then get different outputs. That's the principle and idea of his model of change. We also have Larry Greener's model, and here, this model in OD is about where change is stimulated by outside pressure. So outside pressure, of course, always motivates management to do things, doesn't it, in very, very suitable ways. But what it says is external stimulus happens and then the things happen. So there's a diagnosis of the problem, there's an intervention of the solution, and then a reinforcement of new habits through positive results. So something happens in the outside world, we change, and things change too. And lastly, the other model I wanted to touch on was Levitt's model. So he talked about the premise that all systems, so structure, people, technology, and tasks, all interact with each other. So if there's pressure in one aspect of the system, it will have an effect on the others. So you can't introduce change somewhere without the impact it will have in other places, which again for me resonated a bit with what I know about cybernetics. So I shared those models to illustrate the fact that OD as a field, I think you can probably agree those models are all slightly different ways of looking at organizational interventions and change. And as my favorite quote is, I can't remember who said it, but all models are wrong and some are useful. So some of these models might be useful in different circumstances. And any of those circumstances might be called an OD intervention. A couple of other thinkers that you might know of, Edgar Schein is obviously somebody that's big in OD, talks a lot about culture. Also Richard Beckford and his work on team effectiveness. So some name dropping that you may have come across in your own particular aspects of the field. I can see some comments coming in the chat and I can't see what they are, so I'll save myself for the end for that. So my two shared challenges I wanted to pull out. Firstly, no one knows what it is, so no one knows that they're doing it. And my second one is that practitioners prize individualism and ego over creating a collaborative movement. I think that second one might be a little bit provocative, but I am my father's son. So there we go, that's that. But the first one I wanted to come to is, when I think about this in the practice of being a practitioner of this sort of work, if I told the leaders I work with, on a day-to-day basis, or any of the clients I've worked with, I said, we're going to do an OD initiative, most of them would look at me like I had a third head. If I try to explain what it is, they might find it interesting, because I'm fortunate to work with, with lots of clients that are smart, clever people in their own space. It wouldn't be that interested in the kind of philosophical debate about it necessarily. As I'm sure many of you know, clients come to us with problems, and how we describe our approach to problem solving might be either cybernetics or OD, depending on our own particular history. The other thing that I think was a common characteristic when I think about these two fields is, OD is often described as adaptive, flexible, evolving. Cybernetics is purposeful, complex, adaptive. There's something about the nature of both of these fields of thinking or philosophies or whatever the right term is that makes them quite difficult to pin down, and they're often brought to life in the doing of them rather than in the idea of them. And I think that contributes to this kind of challenge around nobody really knows what it is, because in order to know what it is, you have to actually do it. And the third thing I want to say about this is that, often when we think about people who encounter ideas like this, they might think, oh, that's fascinating and really interesting, could be really useful, but I don't, in my role, have the power or believe I have the power to actually really make change happen. I'm sure we've all had that problem of, if only, I remember when I went to my job interview as a consultant and I went with them and I said, look, this is the organization's problem and here's the 5 work streams we have that if we use them all together, we're going to fix this organization. And of course, when I actually became a consultant, we never did all of those things together because no client ever bought that. So I think there's something about how do we solve micro problems within a bigger systemic problem, and how do we let people know that they have power or to make use of the power they do have? Because I'm sure I'm not the only one that sat in rooms with senior leaders who say, oh, there's a problem, there's a problem, we're not allowed to do that. And when you say who is the we, they are usually the people that are responsible for the thing they're trying to do. But of course, taking that means taking risk and taking accountability if things go wrong. And And the people, I did a lot of assessments, psychological based assessments of people for jobs at various places over my time as a consultant. And the people that were best and did the most amazing work were people that were independently wealthy and could always afford to say, I'm out. So I think that's a very interesting thing when we think about these fields. And then my second point, try not to be too provocative to you, but I think there's a reason why we prize individualism and ego over creating a collaborative movement. You know, lots of us, we all work within a culture, certainly a Western business culture, which rewards, celebrates individual achievement, individual exceptionalism. You know, it's always Jeff Bezos and Amazon, not the 500 million people that work for him. You know, he's not really the one that does it. It's all of those other people, but we prize him, rightly or wrongly, for being the one that you know, made it all happen. You know, when it comes to academics, individual rock star academics are celebrated over millions of other academics that don't get recognised. And so while we might disagree with that as a system, I think it's fair to say we all operate within that system. And therefore we are victims. And so when we're trying to perpetuate our own work, we fall into the same, you know, arguments, ideological arguments with each other about, do you agree or disagree with me? And this is my interpretation of this and you don't. And whilst that's all fine, we've all got to get on and get paid and do something in the world. Otherwise we'll just sit around thinking all day, which is fun, but not very productive. And most of us need to eat in some ways or somewhere or another. And we also have clients that want us to solve problems now, not, well, you know, if you just do this really hard thing, we might be able to solve a more important problem. So there's my two thoughts on the kind of shared challenges of these fields. And I'm going to finish up by talking about then how can we contribute to organizational success in 2021 and beyond. And I'd love to have a really magical answer for you, but I don't think I do. There's two sort of ways I see this playing out. One, we keep doing what we're doing. We are in our own ways making meaningful change. The other one is reinvent it or it'll be reinvented for you. And I wanted to illustrate these points with a couple of examples that I think bring them to life. I know that all of us, I hope all of us anyway, at least feel that we make it through the day and we've made it through our careers doing work that we find meaningful. We've done work for clients that have told us that they've changed things. Lots of the, you know, the ideas and things we have, whilst there may be quantitative, tangible outcomes that we can point to, it can be very difficult to, you know, delineate all the bits of the system which says that this intervention we did as a consultant or a practitioner or a leader had this impact. So we can keep doing what we're doing. All of us, I think, have hopefully jobs that we enjoy and careers that we enjoy, and there's certainly appetite for doing things and making meaningful change. You know, I'm working in the field of diversity and inclusion at the moment. There's a huge amount of appetite and noise and excitement and energy and you know, challenge around that field. I would class lots of the things in D&I as organizational development interventions when we think about how we apply that in the workplace. Whilst at the same time we're trying to change the world. So we can keep doing what we're doing. We can make meaningful change. You know, there was a story from a colleague of mine who decided to implement, as a leader in one of the businesses I work with, who decided to do a no email week. So he banned his team from sending emails to each other, which, as you know, we've all been working from home. It's in our news business. Our news business produces about 5,000 news stories a day. So, you know, that's not the whole one team, but there's a lot being produced, and he wanted less emails. On its own, that is, in my opinion, an OD intervention. Whether it scales, gets, you know, encouraged more widely, that's a big thing to change across sort of 3,000 people in one go. So we can keep doing what we're doing and we can make meaningful change as we go. The other way of looking at it is perhaps we reinvent it or be reinvented for you. And I share this, the example I've got, I think, is the field of agile. And I'm sure many of you would have come across people that talk about agile consultants. I think you can become an agile coach in just 2 days. And I'm somewhat disparaging about the field of it because I've worked with people that do it. There's lots of great people in the field, by the way, but a lot of them are doing things that I would call organizational development. What agile has done as a movement is two things, I think, that have made it very successful. One, it took lots of great management thinking from the last 100 years and gave it a shiny new badge and some fancy labels, different labels, and made everyone feel like they were in squads and tribes and doing stand-ups and all sorts of fun things. which were, anybody who's worked in the fields of organizational development over the years will know are not new, but they made them new, and people like new and sexy and different things, and that's a facet of human nature that I think we'd all do well to embrace. The other thing I think that they did well is they tapped it into a market of people who've got loads of excitement around them and loads of money, which is software developers, right? So that was where a lot of it came from originally. And having spent lots of my career in the place that I'm now working with software developers, I'm sure there's probably software developers on the call. It would be a stereotype, but perhaps not an unfair one, to say that the people and the how you do the work side of things comes less naturally to them. So there's really a market of people that were really keen on this. So my kind of provocation to people that work in OD and cybernetics is there a way to create a meaningful new movement akin to something like Agile, which taps into the zeitgeist of business that exists today, so that the fascinating and useful and interesting ideas we have can reach a bigger proportion of people? And that is where I will end. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Right. So I've got lots of questions written down, but I've got a lifetime to ask them. So Rob Warwick, I noticed that you put a question in the chat just now, which I think was something that Matthew might want to expand on.
Oh, yes, thank you. As I said, I'm a bit of a newbie to cybernetics and feel a bit of a cuckoo. So I'm just interested in how people are tricky, paradoxical, and all. As I said in the box, Hume said we've all got something of the wolf, the the snake, and the dove in us. I mean, how does cybernetics and also OD cope with the trickiness that we all are?
It's a very good question, Rob. I think, well, I'll give you my perspective as a very amateur cybernetician and a somewhat better, probably, organizational development person. I think all of us have to, we deal with imperfect understanding. I remember saying to my organizational psychology professor, what do we really know about human behavior at work? And it couldn't really tell me anything that useful, apart from people that are measured as generally more conscientious are generally more capable of getting things done, and that basically humans will always do the thing you least expect them to do at the last minute, which isn't a very helpful predictive tool to use in any of the work we do. So I think that the cybernetic idea that I think would be most helpful here, and I'd then open it to other cyberneticians on the call, would be the idea of thinking about purpose, because I think a lot of what we don't do well in organizational development is really get people to think about why we're doing something. Half the time, because people don't want to ask that question. It's quite a difficult, uncomfortable question. And sometimes the why is, well, we produce bombs, so we're killing people. That's no disrespect to anybody that works for defense on the call, but when you get to it, that is, I work for the infrastructure of capitalism, and part of me sometimes goes, well, maybe we should just end capitalism. But I am very much ingrained and getting paid by the system which perpetuates capitalism. So there we are. That's my limited answer.
Keith, you might have an insight on that one before I go elsewhere.
Well, I mean, human difficulty is or should be the church's kind of métier, shouldn't it? Because in the church we combine a deep commitment to humanity and all its peculiarity with an aspiration for a very high level of aspiration for what it will be able to achieve or will achieve with God's grace, and quite a pessimistic assessment of what human beings will be like in practice quite a lot of the time. So yeah, we ought to be better. We ought to be very good at handling that. And sadly, I'm not sure that we are actually. I think the church tends to suffer from an idealism about people. Oddly, I know its rhetoric is often perceived as being very critical, but I think actually in practice, the church finds it quite difficult to deal with. So I'm not sure. So I think as with a lot of things, our practice doesn't always offer much assistance, but I think there was a great well of thinking and history of practice which might offer more resource. And that's what I was trying to get at earlier. I think it's not always what's actually going on. It's what's in our background, in our back pocket, if we can rediscover it ourselves.
So Matthew, one of the things I actually wrote down in the middle of all this was, do people not care about the science? Because one of your sort of comments was about they want the problem solved and they don't really care how. Should that matter to us?
No, would be my short answer. My slightly longer answer would be, what do you mean by science? Because I think my favorite, when I studied occupational psychology and we looked at the different, schools of thought around understanding humans and organizations, I find there is things you can measure in human behavior. When you look at the statistics of them and the predictive validity, even the good predictive validity is pretty bad. The way I found and continue to find the best way to understand, or the most helpful way, to understand humans and organizations and how things happen, is about the stories that people tell. Because what meaning people make of what they do is I think that is the most useful thing often to people, rather than what science makes it happen. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask an awkward question because I can, which is that if I am applying science to other people, and I ask this to the crowd as a whole rather than to any one individual really, if I'm applying what I believe to be a scientific technique to a particular problem, and you're just happy to have sort of benefited from it, or perceive yourself to have benefited from it, am I trapping you or am I enabling you in doing that? What's my, from a sort of liberality point of view, what am I doing to you?
Well, one thought I'd have on that is that if you are able to be transparent about the tools that you are using, or able to show people what the impact of your using your tools is, and then empower them to use those tools again, then they are then a greater resource to be able to go and continue to make those changes in the future. I think, looking through some of the comments and Carolyn's comments about a more positive view of ADs, I think some of that, where it's done well, people do have those tools and are able to make that meaningful change, or continue to make that meaningful change after you've gone. And in my role as a consultant, I think there is a school of consulting which is it's sort of parasitic in nature, where the purpose of the consultant is to continue to sell more work to the sort of brain destroyed client. That's being very harsh, but there's definitely consultants need to see that works like that. I think the more enlightened consulting I've seen happen is much more about empowering people through the skills and tools you have as a practitioner, whatever your field happens to be.
Thanks, Matthew. So Carolyn, would you like to come in on that, since you put the comment in the chat, please?
Yeah, I mean, on that, just on that last point, Matthew, I think that that more generative approach to practice is one that I definitely espouse and agree with in terms of what I've seen. So my background is 25 years in the NHS, a few years in the civil service, and now at Maven. So and thanks for the name check earlier as well, Matthew. But yeah, I think in respect to purpose, I think in those parts of the world, it's very that's a kind of, the why question is the easy question in some ways. It's there's often, it's multi-layered, and it's getting further and further underneath to what the real issue is. But I don't think I think that's I wouldn't argue too hard with my doctor colleagues, for example, when I was in the NHS, the science point, because you just we get distracted. But I remember a conversation with a clinical director in emergency medicine, where I took her through an appreciative process in the conversation, and then happened in a follow-up conversation to describe to her how I'd run through that process, and And her comment was, "Oh, it's no wonder I felt so good for the rest of the day." As I was trying to explain how we might do the work with the whole of the emergency department using that process. So the science wasn't something we needed to foreground with her, but giving her an appreciation of that appreciative process helped her see, you know, having had the experience, helped her see why that could be really useful as a way of galvanizing a group of people and helping them to see a different future and helping them work on it collectively. I think that point around on your slide about collective movement, I mean, collective movement. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the NHS is there is a whole movement of OD practitioners who come together and share and work. And we did something similar in the civil service, albeit it's a quarter of the size of the NHS. So, you know, I think where practitioners are working with a sense of who they are and what the field is, and with some confidence, I think you do see that collective movement, both in the work they're doing and in the, you know, the clients, leaving the clients stronger, but also in their collective sense of themselves as a practice, as a system of influence.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to go to Abdul now at this point, because I can see your hand waving, Abdul, please, and then Bernard Scott will be next. So calm down, Bernard, it's fine. I've got 32 pictures I'm looking at. Abdul, you first, please.
I've been waiting 15 minutes, John. Never mind.
Abdul, you're on mute.
Hi there. Sorry, Bernard. I'll be quick. Hi, Matthew. It's really nice to put a face to the name. So you'll know this story better than me, right? So I think the HR director and the CFO were having a conversation, and they said, "Look, I need to train my people," and the CFO said, "Well, the CFO said if I train them, they might leave." And the flip side is, well, if I don't train them, they might stay. So with that said, the idea of purpose and choice, people and parts in organizations, I'm really keen to kind of understand, kind of with your OD and your cybernetics hat on, where does this purpose come from and this choice come from? Because a lot of the times in organizations, we talk about purpose unfolding, but organizations also seem to come up with policies that are very kind of timely. So for example, inclusion and diversity is a very interesting topic right now. It's a real coincidence that lots of organizations are talking about it at the same time, right? So, you know, where does this purpose come from? So I accept sometimes there are regulation things that come from the outside. So kind of, it's not a question, it's just a topic of thought, really. Purpose, how does it emerge, choice, and developing people. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think I'll just say a couple of things on purpose. I think it's interesting because I haven't worked with, since I came to Bloomberg, I haven't worked in, I used to do quite a lot of work with the NHS and other public sector bodies, and I think purpose there is very clear. People really care about why they're there. You know, they really believe in the overarching purpose of the NHS or the civil service, and that is something which grounds them in the quite, to be honest, some of the very toxic cultures that emerge in the doing of that. I think purpose, you know, maybe I've become cynical from working in a Wall Street company for the last 5 years. Purpose is less defined. I think I think there's more opportunity to get people to think differently about purpose, or purpose can be more distributed. I think Bloomberg as a company gives a huge amount of money away to anyway, you know what I mean, charitable causes, huge amounts of profits to go to those causes, which is something that ties people to the organisation. You know, if you have to work for one of the billionaires in the world, I probably pick the best one to work for. But the reasons why people do their jobs, I think when I work with them, it's much more about, some people are really passionate about technology and finance and how those things intersect. Other people just, find themselves swept into a place, and then, to be quite honest, they get paid well and they don't want to leave, they don't know where to go. So I think purpose attracts people in different ways. Would be my observation.
Thanks, Matthew. So I don't know where we're going to go next. So Bernard, you're up, please. You're on mute at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Sorry, I get passionate about some topics, like God and cybernetics. I just put in the chat mainly for the benefit of the discussion on organisation development. If people aren't familiar with Elliot Jax's book, requisite organisation. It's worth a read. He makes a very interesting distinction between associations, which are like the church as an association, distinct from what he calls management accountable hierarchies, which are organisations constructed to do work, where people are employed to do work. So the Church of Light is an association. That's why bishops have all this autonomy and so on. It's not an association of peers, but it's a hierarchy association, different thing. But for Keith, well, for general topic about purpose, and specifically for Keith, back in my mind is what's known as the primary principle of war. If you're not familiar with the principles of war, as set out by Sun Tzu and developed by the British Army, I recommend them to you. The first principle is that you establish and maintain your aim. In other words, your purpose. You establish it, you decide what it is, and then you maintain it. You don't go on a mission drift. You don't get lost. And that applies very much to the church in the broadest sense, the body of Christ, because the two big commandments I recall. One is each of the four Gospels ends with what's known as the Great Commission, which is to spread the good news of the gospel. That's the Great Commission. And the other great commandment is to St. Peter when he said, "Feed my sheep." So these are central, if you like, central theological points that a good debate should centre on. So I'm following Keith and saying, really, we need the church generally needs a root and branch revolution, and the young people need to be brought into the debate in sophisticated ways. And I first questioned atheism and the existence of God when I was a teenager. That's when I formulated many of my thoughts, questions about what the church was doing and so on. But that's the idea. So, but the question to Keith is, how are you looking at the bigger picture, which is the Church of Christ at large in the world as a whole? And are you looking at what's happening in different parts of the world? And are you also looking how the different denominations function in different parts of the world? And again, these are topics I've looked into, but I'm interested to see if you're paying attention to these, because there are still parts of the world where Christianity is flourishing. And I understand that there are some churches, some African churches, send missionaries into the UK to help spread the gospel. Keith?
Well, I mean, you know, I'm doing a PhD, and one is encouraged to narrow one's field a little in order to make it doable. So I have concentrated on the Church of England, you know, because it's a kind of manageable. Well, that's big enough, but it's a kind of manageable concept. I tell you what I do think, though, and I'm not sure if it relates to what you've said, but it relates, I think, to what other people have said. I think it picks up one or two comments you made in the chat, which is, I think the Church of England, or any long-established religious organisation or church, is in the interesting position. I think it's quite interesting anyway, of being an institution that stands, that kind of exists to support a movement. You know, I mean, you know, that I think that's what the church kind of started as, and what it probably ought to be. It ought to have the characteristics of a movement. That is, it has, you know, powerful and I think still revolutionary ideas about how our lives should be or could be as individuals and corporately. And yet, in order to sustain that over time, these things have become, you know, the church has become also a series of institutions.
So Keith, has it become pathologically autopoietic? It's pursuing its own existence rather than the mission of God? Yeah,
I think that's right. That is true. That's part of the picture. But it's also true, though, that I think to sustain anything over time, you need something that looks, you know, remarkably like an institution or an organization. So I think there is a tension there that is probably not fully resolvable in, you know, given our, you know, given the reality of what human life is like. But yes, I think it does need to recover quite a lot of the dynamics of that founding sense of movement. Yeah.
Thanks. So Richard Berry, would you like to come in? I've saved your question about joint purpose. I'd like to come to you, and then I'd like to go to Angus afterwards, because Angus has also put a good one. So could you, are you there, Richard? You're on mute, and I can't see your mouth moving.
Hi, John. Sorry. Yes. Do apologise. Yeah. So everything I've heard tonight from Keith, and I know from our recent conversations, John, and my own work, and certainly from Matt, sort of pushed me towards complexity. And I'm still grappling with complexity theories and cybernetics as an example. But where everything does overlap is dealing at recursive layers with the issue of complexity in systems, whether they be technology, processes, organizations, bureaucracies, and good old-fashioned people, and people as cybernetic beings themselves, you know, the kind of person in the present within the constraints of the environment they're working, and obviously very much shaped by their history. So I'm just wondering, when Matt was posing, I think, the question around what is the joint purpose here? Can cybernetics and OD kind of come together? In an increasingly complex world that's perhaps not making a lot of sense to some people, certainly doesn't to me at times, the question of, can you develop organizations post-COVID, perhaps a good time to do it, with a focus, organizations and systems post-COVID with a sense of purpose around dealing with complexity? Because I think that's the bit that's, excuse the pun, but trumping us all at the moment.
Right, well, I hope somebody can answer that question, because I'm not convinced that I can at the moment, off the top of my head. So you're suggesting we need organizational systems for purposefully addressing the complexity of the system that we've created?
Whether we've created it, John, or whether it's been created for us, I think is an interesting question. But certainly the systems we presently face. So, for example, if you take the health service, the issue of corporate medicine versus the values of a medical practitioner sometimes come into conflict, and it's how you deconstruct that conflict. We see moral questions, particularly in political life at the moment, daily, and they're complex and they're difficult, and there's technology in there, there's money in there, there's all sorts of mix in there, there's, you know, post-truth news coverage. You know, at some point we've got to start unpacking some of this and creating some sense around it.
Does our joint purpose then emerge, because Matthew mentioned the notion of alignment, and I know, Keith, in the sort of church, you kind of got to believe in it if you're going to rock up every Sunday morning and do the stuff you're supposed to do. So yeah, is alignment, which would be something, the concept we might see in the OD world, the mechanism that we knew we could use for generating shared purpose? And I'll sort of look at Matthew with that, because I think it's a because you mentioned alignment, so you get it back, really.
Yeah, thanks. It's always a pleasure to be given a question that no one knows an answer to. I think that I would almost take it to them, like, try and take it up a level. I think what I was trying to propose to the group is not necessarily that cybernetics and OD merge as fields or develop a joint movement, though that could be an outcome. I wasn't necessarily proposing that. I think that they are both, I think both fields are in service of helping organizations be more successful, whatever that means. I think I think both things should think about purpose, and I think purpose is very, I suppose I'd actually change the question to, like, how are the tools, techniques, facets of both these fields useful in solving complex problems? I think they already are to a certain degree. And then my brain starts to sort of misfire and malfunction, I'm afraid, having been at this computer since this morning.
Are they complementary then? So
I hope so. I mean, I always think about this whole field, right? Everything I do, you know, what you might do. This is my kind of arguments I've had with people that I work with that do agile, you know, I'm like, this isn't new, but they've just given it a slightly different label that is very appealing and popular at the moment. And like, part of me, there's sort of part of me thinks, oh, I wish I'd come up with that first. And a part of me thinks, well, you don't really know what you're talking about. You're not as well studied as I am. And there's lots of things like my own individual ego in there, which, you know, have they made a difference to the way the bits of the business they work with function? Yes. And is that good enough? Why not? So whether it's cybernetics or AD or whatever, if a tool is useful, you know, and some interesting research from around the whole field of coaching actually is I learned about recently was, you know, the best coaches are not the people that can do the best coaching as prescribed by all the various models and accreditations you can do around coaching. The best coaches were the ones that knew which tool to pick from at what appropriate moment. And I think we could all benefit from having as many tools in our toolkit as possible, given how complicated the problems are we're trying to solve.
That's brilliant. Thank you. That gives me a really good segue into Angus's question, because Angus is going to talk to us. I think you need to explain rather than anything else, Angus, your notion of effortless change, please.
All right. Thank you very much, John. Let me say, as someone who's got about 30 years of OD experience, I found it a very fascinating couple of talks. Thank you very much. And I thought it was particularly interesting to take something like so massive and so ancient and so complicated as it was put out, like the church as a case study. It's brilliant. And I also pricked up my ears very interestedly when Matthew talked about forming some kind of identity for cybernetic practice in OD. I think that's really interesting to work with. So turning to Richard's last question, for example, and what I was saying about effortless change, there is a methodology that's been developed for how one goes about designing change. And it works with the grain of the organization. So when we heard about the idea in the church, would it be possible to use the structure of the church by rethinking what it was called and then deploying something that worked with the grain of how the organization was, but made suitable adjustments to bring about the outcome that was required? That's the sort of thinking that is in the right direction for what the same or aligned direction for what this effortless change does. It works with the way the organization is. And how that works is that when a change is put in, it operates as a kind of free fall. It just simply happens through the organization. Now, to begin that, and this, you know, I'm going to speak for a couple of minutes, so this is not going to be a full-on explanation. But one of the key points, and it goes back to what Richard was saying, is that it's very rarely useful to start with the problem that people think they've got. If they really understood their problem, it probably wouldn't exist. So it's not the place usually to start with. The place to start with is the outcome. So comments like Drucker's objectives, that's kind of useful. It's cybernetic to be clear about what's the outcome, what are you trying to achieve? And usually that's not really precisely clear. Once you're clear about that, the question then is not how complicated and complex it is, but how much can we filter out of what's going on that's irrelevant to the problem of change, and what's left? What's actually left in bringing about the outcome specifically that you want to have? If you're dealing with something as big as a church, it's not going to be done in one change, but a series of changes can be done. And each of those can be designed in such a way that what you do, and it works with cybernetics, cybernetics works with how things are perceived by people. So you're making markers or tokens or context changes in the organization that signal to people the sorts of things that they want to see and they respond to in such a way that they bring about the outcome that you want. Now, this sounds really facile and very simple because I'm only speaking for a couple of minutes, but there's a highly developed technology, you can say, thinking technology for doing that kind of thing.
Thank you, Angus. And you're clapping. It's nice to see you, by the way. Are you clapping, or do you have a comment to add?
I was clapping for Angus. I can add a comment if you'd like, John.
Yeah, go for it.
Nice to see you too. And hi, everyone. So I'm an OD practitioner too. I work for a telecommunications company. And I've also, background is in management consulting, worked in OD for a long time. I think what's really great about both cybernetics and OD, because I actually didn't know about cybernetics, but have been doing OD, and I can definitely see many affinities and parallels between the two disciplines and how they can be used for one another. But it's when you mentioned Drucker and what you were just describing there, Angus, I think the idea around objectives and key results, which is an agile practice that people are using at the moment, very, very on trend for the technology companies. That's a great way to kind of look at things as they are, how they could be, and also to tie in the purpose element. Because I think it doesn't matter almost the tools, how you get there. I think looking at things, taking the data that's available and seeing what's possible with that, I think that's the opportunity where OD and cybernetics can come together to create something new and better. So, so that's my tuppence, that's my comment for today, John.
Thank you, Anne. That's great. Do you have a response, Angus? Are you happy? Because Bernard's got his hand up. So
I'm happy.
in that case, thank you both. I shall move on. Bernard.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Thank you, John. No, it's something I put in the chat earlier. I just want to sort of remind people, perhaps they don't know, that cybernetics came into being in the forces as a transdiscipline, where people from different disciplines, social sciences, natural sciences, engineering, and so on, came together to discover that they were had similar issues to do with organization, basically, how living systems are organized, how cultures are organized, and so on. And they realized that there was a body of concepts which could help unite their efforts. They could see that they were looking at similar problems in terms of control, communication, and viability of organizations. And that's where cybernetics begins. So it's transdiscipline that brought clarity amongst variety. So it reduces variety when you look at the world. And in particular, it's very good at reducing variety in what Nicholas Luhmann refers to as the marketplace of ideas. There's too much noise, too much resonance in the world of ideas. We have all these competing traditions, disciplines, approaches. Cybernetics gives you a way of looking at the world to see how things are similar, not different. To that extent, I would say that there really is no viable, no sensible, discernible distinction between organizational development, as I'm hearing, as practice, and cybernetics. You are doing cybernetics. You may not have realized it, but you are. And okay, and if someone said in the chat, well, if you're doing cybernetics, you're doing organizational development. Well, yeah, fair enough. But it's important to see that what is similar beneath the labels. You know, we're using similar distinctions and so on. So
helpful.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Now I'm going to go to Chris Heald, who Chris and I have been having some interesting conversations over recent months on the subject of cybernetics and organisation. So Chris, you want to introduce yourself and bring your thread in on the trialogue.
I'll start by saying actually I agree with Bernard's point. So I think OD and cybernetics have there's a huge amount of commonality, and actually ODs are, the way in which you would all, could organize a system effectively, a cybernetic system effectively. The point I was making really was about the human dimension, which I don't think we touch on quite as much as maybe we should, because for me, effective cybernetics or OD work will only be sustainable if the people are engaged in it and it fits with them and it fits with their purpose as well as the organizational purpose, because we've got this whole thing about alignment of identity within organizations. I mean, that plays to the work that I might choose to do, but I think it also will sustain systems and organizations, because if it doesn't fit with the people, well, they'll be off at some point.
Thanks, Chris. And Bruce, you're on mute and we can't see you.
Hello. I'd just like to build on some of the thoughts around OD and cybernetics. And as a manager, I learned a number of models, and one was the STAR model, which I posted in the box. It wasn't until recently that I realized that if you look at the STAR model, it has the lines that go in between the circles. And I started realizing that that's a system representation. And thinking of team as a system and organizations as systems gives a slightly different perspective. And then I took a deep dive into living systems. And I worked with those for a while. And I realized that when you look at teams and organizations as living systems, that's sort of underneath the standard models that people have. It kind of gives a view from a different perspective, and seeing a person as a system and understanding their abilities and capabilities, and then seeing that person in a team, in a network of communication or a network of collaboration, you start understanding that that's a kind of a complex structure that has emergent behaviors. And in looking at the social system model that Luhrmann has, and bringing that together with Maturana's structural coupling and some of the other concepts there, you start realizing that this concept of communication in a network is actually where all the change happens. And I've found in my management practice that listening happens to become a very important element of working in a network of communication with people. And these are just things that now I see, but it's all communication has feedback, and it has the other elements of actually making changes. Another concept that came into this in the social system, I guess there have been debates about whether social systems are autopoietic or not, but there are some people like Luhrmann who talk about communication being the autopoietic element, and being able to sense the aliveness of a social system through the quality of the communication in an organization. And seeing and working with that has actually been it's made quite a difference to my management practice. And it's enabled results that I wouldn't have anticipated. But so that's just some of the observations that I've had around looking at organizations as people and how they interact, and then looking at the properties of that team within the organization as part of organization design or organization development. But it seems like a very natural fit. But it was a big surprise to me to actually be part of that and experience living organizations and living teams. So I just thought I'd share that, and hopefully that makes some sense.
Thanks, Chris. I think there's a lot of sympathy for the idea of organisations as living systems, and I think we have to play with the idea of what do we mean by living. And some of the organisations I've worked in, we might have to wonder what we mean by the word sentient as well. Yeah, that's probably sort of a bit of a harsh criticism, really. So, Mr. Bryant, I can see you're here, but you've been very quiet tonight. Have we baffled and lost you, or is there something wandering around in your head?
Well, I've been fiddling around in the background on the, just making a few comments here and there, but I mean, my own position, as I think you know, is that everything's down to behaviours. So organisations are systems of behaviours, and it's the behaviours that make the difference, not the structure. The structure is there to enable the behaviours to take place. So in my view, we should be focusing on the behaviours, not the structure. The structure should form itself around the behaviours, which also means that it has to frequently change as the behaviours need to alter, because it's merely there to make the behaviours most efficiently able to be delivered. That's not really an English sentence, but I think you know what I mean.
So what's the mechanism that then causes the behaviour change, that causes the adaptation, James?
Oh, you just lobbed one up for me there, I think. Well, my own view is it's displacement. So yeah, Ashby says disturbance is a thing that causes displacement, and that we all respond by behaving to things that try to displace us, and organizations likewise. So all the behaviors that we see are due to forces of displacement. So if you take the, as was being discussed about the following the intent, if you take the actual, you know, the definition of cybernetics as the helmsman, the organization is trying to navigate its boat from wherever it happens to be across the turbulent, disturbed seas to wherever its destination is trying to be. And therefore, cybernetics is the guy on the tiller trying to make us, you know, the behavior that they undertake, waggling the tiller around against the disturbance that's trying to misdirect it away from its destination.
So are we then asking, I'm sort of puzzling with this one, because the thread that's emerging for me tonight is this notion of sort of purpose and identity and so on, and saying that these two very separate talks have this sort of thread in common coming together. Almost a description when you say the behavior emerges and it sort of conditions. It sounds like a passive responsive system as opposed to an active participant in the discussion. So where do we get the active participation? That's, you know, if we can observe purpose, and we can observe, you know, Derby County to lose at football matches, for example. I believe they did again last night or fairly recently. Yeah, that's surely not what. So the difference between the purpose as realised, this is what happened, and the purpose as intended, this is what we wanted. So how do we get to the this is what we want question around purpose and intent, either in OD or cybernetics or both, because they seem to be merging into the same space? Where do we get that from? If it's all about individuals working together or towards a common end, how do we agree that there's a shared intent? Keith?
John, something I've been thinking about as the conversation's gone on, we got very close to it a little while ago and we've come back to it again, I think, is that in my mind, there's something here about the relationship between structure and freedom, you know, to find a way of putting it. And I got that from Matthew as well. So you've got situations where you've got organizational structures and organizationally determined objectives and so forth, but you've got to work with the reality of individuals and people and their situations, and the same is true in the church, of course, as in every organization, but it has a particular kind of ideological flavor in that context. And you're also dealing with the fact that the desire for freedom, you know, is expressed much more strongly than perhaps than ever before. You know, routinely an organization, everybody expects to be free or wants to be, whatever that is. And yet, you know, people have as soon as they get involved in an organization, they've got to be part of something to which they have to shape themselves to some degree to be there. So how we negotiate that is the challenge, and I think it's about conversation, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. So I would argue that, you know, other than the legal, you know, there's a registration at Companies House, so we know there's a legal entity. You know, the organisation only exists through the interactions of the people that give it life. So it doesn't have a purpose that's independent of the interactions of all the people that make it up. So how and where does the organisational purpose that they align to, how the hell does that emerge? Right, James, and then Angus.
Well, I would argue or suggest that to begin with, our own motivations come from actually existing. So, you know, if you look at Maslow, for example, Maslow's pyramid is a good thing to sort of fall back on. So to begin with, we all want to survive, and then as you go up, you want to thrive. So if you take the church as an example, it's a gathering together of people with similar intents or beliefs, as it happens to be, and then when they gather together as a group, there's an intent and a desire to continue, and in this case survive against an amount of displacement. So, and the same with organizations, you know, it's a gathering together of a bunch of people to follow a purpose of an organization, and from there the seed grows.
Okay, Angus, you had your hand up as well, I think, and then Matthew.
Yes, thank you. And I can build on what was just being said. People, I think, act looking for meaning in several different senses of it. Meaning in the sense that we want meaning, we want something purposeful, we want something that we value in our lives. And meaning also in the sense that we negotiate what we're doing according to the meanings that we perceive, determine in the world around us, in our context. So when an organization constructs a meaningful situation, when it does things, when it designs the way the office is laid out, or what a screen looks like, or what a product looks like, or how a process works, they create something that's an artifact of meaning. It means things to people. It means things to customers at the end of the day that you wanted to have, but it also means things to the participants in the company. Each of those people are looking for something that they want to do. It may be that what they're looking for is the least worst alternative in a difficult situation, but they're looking for something. And so the alignment that's been talked about takes place. So that also speaks to what was being said about freedom and so on. We human beings have a yearning for the ability to express themselves and so on. And Maslow, various people work with this. That to me is a basic principle, expressed probably a bit crudely and quickly, but what it means is that people are responsive and acting towards goals that they want to achieve. What an organization does is create a kind of contextual field in which different people come together and their individual objectives align with the organizations, and in the process produce the organizations, which in turn produces the individual, because there's a feedback loop in which what's going on creates context. The notion of stigmergy is one of the interesting things that one could look at in terms of as a kind of analogy for how this works. And later this month, I think it's on the 25th, the fourth Tuesday, Pilar Burnell, who's in the group, will be talking about, in response to the unfortunate absence of Humberto Maturana, will be talking about the ways in which confluences of meaning and interpretation between people create forms, behaviors, and ongoing patterns of behavior in people. I think that may be part of what she talks about. It's certainly an important field. And so if you're interested in this subject, it will be part of the next session.
Thanks, Angus. Matthew.
I just want to make it's my attempt to make a link between what I talked about and Keith's talk about religion, and it prompted me to think in the context of purpose, how important as church, it has become less important in our Western society anyway, how much more important our identities become very wrapped up in work. And of course, we all sit here doing jobs that we've largely chosen and are of intellectual and personal interest to us. And I think that differs from a large portion of the working population, who are people that work, in ways because they have to. So I think we speak from a very privileged position, and so it's very privileged to be able to say, I use my work as a mechanism to achieve my purpose, which is, can be a great thing. It can also be quite dangerous. And it makes me think of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the research and work of Esther Perel, who talks a lot about relationships and infidelity, and how in the age we live in, relationships, like our jobs, have become incredibly important markers of our identity. And if we lose our jobs, we lose who we are. Have we? I guess the question I leave us on is, have we sold our purpose to corporations for money? And should we, if we developed more spiritual practice, does that mitigate some of that?
Keith, thank you, Matthew. Keith, I'll give you a final comment on that one. We've got 1 minute if you want to.
I think those are profoundly important questions, and I think I do think the resolution to the challenges of the kind that of freedom and structure, our purpose versus the demands of the system in the negative sense of it, do require some kind of practice or tradition of spiritual awareness to resolve. Yes, I do think that.
Thanks, Keith. Listen, everybody, it's 4 minutes to 7, and I've promised to be home in time for tea. So, as ever, we've had two very provocative and different talks, which have brought us, I think, to some sort of understanding that when we're doing OD, we're doing cybernetics. When we're doing cybernetics, we're doing OD. And the common thread, maybe, is the notion of purpose and alignment around the achievement of outcomes. Whether or not either of them is a science, we can leave for debate on another occasion. So, as ever, I will convert this into a shareable video and get it onto the website as soon as we practically can, so those who missed out can catch up. But a few things happening over the next month. Next week, next Thursday afternoon, we're hosting the first of a series of things called Not a Conference. And we are talking about the notion of how to organise a university. This is jointly with the Centre for Information Management at Loughborough University, where we have Leon, who's a final year student, Nick Tyler, who's an academic, and Catherine Laws, who's a societal observer, is probably the best way of describing Catherine at this point, who will each give us 3 provocations on their interpretation of the question, which is how to organise a university, with the intention of distilling from that a joint paper, if you like, a sort of joint white paper on what we think a university is all about. So rather than running a conference where everybody comes along with a pre-prepared answer, we're going into a 3-hour session with a half-prepared question, and we'll see what comes out at the end of it. You can book that in the usual way on Eventbrite. So that's on the whatever it is, the 20th, I think that's correct. Angus, you've talked about your event on the 25th. Again, you can book that on Eventbrite. Is there anything you wanted to add to what you've already said? You're on mute.
Thanks. Just to say that Pilar Burnell is the secretary of the Cybernetics Society. She will be the leading speaker on this, but it will be, in addition to that, it will be an opportunity for all of those who found autopoiesis to be an important part of their thinking, or would like to hear more about it, to share and remember and review what this has meant to them, and what Humberto Maturana, who's was a remarkable human being, apart from being a scientist, a really remarkable human being who's triggered whole new ways of thinking about thinking and thinking about the world.
Thanks, Angus. And again, 9th of June, so just about a month away, the next of these events will feature our friend Richard Berry, who's on the bottom of my screen.
John, can I interrupt? Can I say it's worth saying that the book that Pilar helped to edit is called Biology of Love.
It's called the origin of humanness in the biology of love.
Right.
Thank you, Pilar.
Relevant given the conversation we've been having.
Yeah, that's thank you. So we can put that in the chat, Angus, and we'll share it. So next month, Richard Berry has been with us tonight. Richard is another researcher working on the future of policing, so a systems perspective on transformations of British policing. So hopefully we've contributed something tonight, Richard. And we will also have John Oakland. John is the British guru on the notion of quality and continuous improvement in organisations. John will be coming along and talking about cybernetics and quality 4, which is his sort of next interpretation of the quality field. And John has just realised that he's a cybernetician, so that's great. So he'll be along next month. So can we say, please, thank you to Keith and Matthew in the usual way, and we'll sort of wave our hands or rattle our jewellery, whatever it is John Lennon used to say. Say thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time. Good night.